what's up? Another episode of Ripple Effect Podcast. Today we got author, investigative journalist, and founder of WhoWhatWhy.com, a nonprofit news website where you can get up-to-date news on current events, historical events. He's really has quite the resume, Russ Baker. He's written for the New Yorker, New York Times, Vanity Fair, Los Angeles Times, Washington Post, Esquire, and just tons of people. And he really blurs the line between mainstream and alternative media because he's written and investigated a lot of stories for mainstream media, but yet he's not afraid to go wherever these topics take him or wherever these facts take him, and not afraid of any topics where a lot of stories might be taboo or mainstream media might not dig into them as much or at all. And mostly because, let's be honest, mainstream media has kind of become a joke with commercials. Really is the number one thing. Between segments, those commercials, whoever's putting those ads on there, it's important, one, to talk about whatever gets viewers watching, if that means celebrity bullshit or if that means Ebola or if that means Malaysia airplane speculation and no new information for weeks and weeks, just to, and keep showing people this little headline that says breaking news so people tune in and they realize, holy shit, there's no breaking news. That's important to keep those ratings high, because the higher those ratings are, the more they can sell that ad space between segments, those commercials. And obviously, those guys who are paying top dollar for that ad space also has a hand in what stories they hit or the way to spin certain stories. They obviously don't want to say anything that would be bad for PR for any of those companies. So it's basically theater. The game's kind of rigged, and that's why it's important to have people like the Young Turks and James Corbett and Ben Swan and obviously Russ Baker and WhoWhatWhy.com that give you an alternative spot to research information and research stories and get just the real facts and what's really going on. And because obviously, like I said, I think TV is kind of it's kind of the past, and I think the internet's the future. I think that a lot of people already have canceled their cable, and I'm one that have actually contemplated it quite a few times. And I mean, I watch all my news, like RT online and Breaking the Set with Abby Martins, and I get a lot of my news from my Twitter feed from following people like Who, What, Why, and I think that's the future. Like I said, I really think that my generation and the younger generations, they're not going to be as easily tricked, and I think that's going to be a huge changing factor. And I mean, for example, I'm doing this intro on Election Tuesday, and people are talking about politics at work and on Facebook, and it just like the whole thing just seems ridiculous and a joke. I mean, Russ Baker said himself on the podcast, and I also say it quite a few times, the idea that, even if you don't care about politics care about you. And it's true to the aspect of it affects how much you get taxed, if you have good health care, universal health care, if you have a retirement plan, how many days, what your minimum wage is, all these things. So it's like, if you want to go on with your life and pretend it doesn't affect you, of course it affects you. You can't avoid it. And I think that's important to state, because I think these conversations are important. When you have an interview with somebody like Russ Baker and we talk about all these elites and how they're all linked together and how they, basically their purpose is to stay in power. Just like the Roman Empire, the number one goal of an empire is to stay an empire and stay in power and keep everybody else below them. And you see it now. The price of everything goes up, but the middle class is making more money. But yet the price of everything is going up. So where's that extra money going to? It's going to the top. It's funneling right to the top. We have some of the worst income equality in the world. I think that, when I did this episode, for example, with Russ Baker, it was a Friday. We got out of work. A couple guys came over my house and we had a couple glasses of wine. It's amazing how happy people are when they're not at work and they're not consumed. And it just sucks because we live in this world where this noble life is going to work, paying your bills. You basically, that corporate job, that job that you have sucks every piece of health, all your best years, all your blood, sweat, and tears. Everything goes into this company that once you pass away, it just continues running anyways, and it doesn't care about you. It doesn't care. So, and I just think that society doesn't have to be this way. It's the way we end up, and it's the way that society's molded at the moment. But then you look at so many other different ways of thinking, like the Zeitgeist movement or any other outside of the box thinking that you could look at it. It's like, holy shit, like society doesn't have to be like this. Why can't we have a 3-day or 4-day work week? Why can't we work less hours a day? We have automation. We have science. We have technology that for these things, and we could focus more on creative aspects and passions. So I could spend more time doing podcasts, or anybody listening to this could spend more time doing music, or spend more time doing arts, any art that they're into, or playing sports or whatever, and just spend more time doing things we actually want to do and not things we have to do. I mean, the idea that our life is working 5 days a week, most of our energy, most of our time goes into this job, then 2 days out of the week we can recoup, we can find some time for our personal stuff, and that's okay, and that's acceptable, is insane. It doesn't have to be that way. And I think that people do have to stand up. We have the Million Mask March coming up November 5th, which is tomorrow, and just all these things. And it reminds us that people are upset. People should be out there and sparking these conversations. But I think the election thing is ridiculous. I think you shouldn't vote for anybody unless it's a third party. And I think after the last two presidents, if anybody's not convinced yet that it's not a big joke, and then I think you should be convinced now. And I think that's my rant for now. Sorry, but I'm just really passionate. I think having these conversations with Russ Baker and these guests like this are very well informed. It reminds everybody how rigged the game is. But we also have to be reminded that every great change has started with somebody, an idea, and somebody who's willing to spark the conversation. And with that said, also I want to remind you guys that at the end of this podcast, there's going to be a mono version of a Theory 6 song that's going to be on my upcoming EP that I've been talking about and trying to release. And I promise I will very soon. But the reason why this podcast is mono and the music's mono is just because it's a smaller file. It takes up less space for the storage I'm paying for, and also for your phone when you download it and stuff like that. So do that. Also subscribe to us, retweet the show, retweet any of the guests' information or work, anything you're passionate about. Definitely, you don't think it's a very important deed, but you can expose one person to a new thing that might change their whole consciousness or awareness to what's going on. So with that said, enjoy the show, and I'll talk to you guys soon. Peace.
Believe in the ripple effect.
It's my pleasure, and let me say that I appreciate your being interested in talking about these topics. One of the things I discovered when my book, Family of Secrets, came out, by the way, in paperback it's got a different subtitle, which I think better characterizes the contents, and the paperback subtitle is The Bush Dynasty, America's Invisible Government, and the Hidden History of the Last 50 Years. Because as you pointed out, it really is about a lot more than the Bushes. But my 5 years of investigative research into the rise of George W. Bush and then of his father basically took me down some rabbit holes where I began to realize that there was a lot of stuff going on in this country that I, as a journalist covering politics, had no idea about. And it provided a whole new context for me in understanding some of the great events and tragedies of the last half century or so. So yes, this really kind of triggered a whole different thinking for me about how things work. That then led to my founding Who, What, Why, which, as you mentioned, is a nonprofit investigative and analytical news site. And we pride ourselves in going after any story and every story. And what our attitude is, rather than going for the low-hanging fruit or the story of the day that everybody's chasing, let's identify some major stories that have not been fully addressed, some major question marks that need to be answered. And so that's really what we've been doing. We've been trying to figure out where are the key pressure points in our society, where are there clues to how our government works, the power centers work. We're looking for explanations of why it is, for example, that America seems to be perpetually embroiled in war, why it is that the 1% keeps getting richer and more powerful and nothing can be seemingly done about it. These are the kind of things that interest us. And I appreciate your having me on the show, because one of the things I experienced when Family of Secrets came out was that everybody wanted me on their shows, but a lot of them got cold feet. Particularly, I would say it was the bosses. It wasn't the line producers. It wasn't the bookers. They were very, very excited to have me on to talk about these concepts, because it's exciting. It's interesting stuff, and everybody wants to hear about it. And I discovered the full extent to which it's not so much that there is an organized effort to keep the truth from the people. It's that we're all in some ways complicit, that we're all in some ways fearful, and this has become ingrained in us, and we make calculations about how to survive within the system and how to survive in general. We're all, a lot of us, I would certainly say, are afraid of something, maybe more than something. And so I tip my hat metaphorically to you for being willing to talk about these kinds of important matters.
Well, I think it's important to talk about for many reasons. I think that, like on my show, I try to have on anybody who I find interesting. And especially early in the show, I had a lot of documentary filmmakers and people from alt media. And it was because that stuff, I was very passionate about that stuff. And I figured that the people doing that work would also be passionate about that stuff. So they probably would I'd have a better chance at having somebody like that on before I actually got any type of resume, because they would be just passionate about that work. And I happen to be right. And it was, James Corbett came on, and all these people who came on early on the show. And I just thought, I'm like, if they're as passionate about this information that they're sharing as much as I am, reading it, and how much it bothers me to kind of spark these conversations, then they might come on, even if it is a small show at the moment. And I was right. And I think that there is something about when you do this type of research that it bothers the hell out of you. And it just like, you can't help but want to share it. You can't help but like get angry, because, you talked about, you hit on income equality. There's tons of statistics that can show just how bad America's income equality is, and all the money just funneling to the top. I mean, I always make the basic statement of, well, if the prices of everything's going up, but none of us are making more money, then where's all that extra money we're spending on stuff going? Well, it's going to the top, and it's an easy way of knowing that, or noticing that, obviously there's a huge issue. And also the other thing is too, is like, politics and all this stuff. Like, it's just one of those things that sometimes people are like, oh, I just don't want to bother with that. But I think it's like, well, you might not want to bother with politics, but politics and learning history, that all affects your everyday, from like the reason why you have 5-day work weeks, to the reason why, the minimum wage is what it is, to what your freedoms aren't and are, what they can lock you up for, what they can't. That's all stuff that affects your everyday life. And so to say that, oh, I'm not worried about that, and you're just going to go on with this basic routine of going to work and paying your bills and whatever, and ignoring it, like every great change in the world started off with one person being upset about something and sparking the conversation. And that, could blossom into or a ripple effect, to use my title, and that's why I truly believe in the ripple effect, and I believe that we all could and can make a difference, even if it's as simple as sparking the conversations and just getting these topics, get people to talk about these topics. And I think that when people do talk about it, you do see passion come out, even with people who say they don't care about politics. You get them talking about it, and a lot of times you do say, like, oh, that's so fucked up. Oh my God, you're right. And it's like, you see, it motivates you the same way it motivates me, and it bothers you. And I think that, when there's people out there who, there's companies that can go out of business and can't pay their bills, but yet, banksters, get bailouts, and who are making trillions of dollars. And if their company goes out of business, they're still going to be wealthy and millionaires, and their kids are going to be all set, and their kids are going to be all set. I just think that, people have to look at these things and realize why, one, learning history is important, because you realize how you got here. And two, just paying attention to current events and question things, because learning history, I think you realize that a lot of the things that are happening today has happened in the past. It's just we just are talking via Skype and the internet, and not at a pub drinking, but even though our surroundings have changed and our technology has changed, we still have a lot of the same issues. Corruption's still an issue, and that's not going to change. And I think that's a very important point to kind of highlight.
Indeed, and you mentioned about people that say they don't want to bother with politics. My response would be, well, politics wants to bother with you, and if any of us have people in our families who came from other countries or know people who have lived under authoritarian or totalitarian regimes, they will tell you that it can just come out of nowhere. And if you are not vigilant and if you're not prepared and if you don't care, these kinds of things can happen anywhere. And at that point, it's too late. And one of the tragedies in this country, and I feel this is a growing trend, is the overall apathy. And that's in all classes, that there's a tremendous indifference. And I think this is by design. I think that all of these distractions, the things that we fill our time up with, the jobs, and then much of our social lives end up being sort of circumscribed by the jobs. We probably don't even think about this, but social events, charity events that we're encouraged to participate in, which are put on again by the employer. And so a big share. And then we go out on our own and we socialize with coworkers. Maybe we date or marry coworkers. And so there's all of that. And then what do we do with the free time when we're wanting to relax or do something else? We watch televised sports. This takes up literally every year. I saw some crazy number, thousands of hours the average person's year spent consuming this stuff. And of course it has some entertainment value. I'm not disputing that. But because we have so little free time, we in our free time goes televised sports, organized religion, certain kinds of entertainment that we're told we should consume, shows and movies that are heavily advertised to us, books that are heavily promoted, and then everybody's reading the same books that everybody else is because that's what we've heard of. And this touches me personally because with, for example, Who, What, Why, and to another extent with Family of Secrets, people often say to me, well, I never heard of that, or how come I haven't heard of that? And I said, well, you've only heard of what you've heard of. And I also have sort of coined a saying, only half facetious, which is, if you've heard of it, it can't be too good. And I guess what I mean by that is that often the biggest brands are the ones that get all of that publicity, and they are promoted again by these large corporations who have certain interests, and they don't want them talking about certain things they don't want them talking about. Even the shows that we really do like and that we see as sort of breakthroughs, the kind of Comedy Central HBO shows that are more political, even those shows are more controlled than you might imagine. If you look carefully at them, the guests tend to be establishment figures, and they tend to, even if the hosts make a little bit of fun, they're generally deferential when people purportedly from the very much opposite side, Donald Rumsfeld or someone that comes on, they kind of make good cheer with them, and they get to hawk their book.
Well, and the guy from Blackwater recently on The Daily Show, perfect example, right? The guy, I forget his name, the head of Blackwater, he was also on Daily Show. And,
Eric Prince. Yeah. You know, and so this is interesting because in a weird way they make these people kind of a little more cuddly, a little more, you might not like them, but, you kind of laugh and you say, well, how bad could they be? He's not going to have Adolf Hitler on the show.
Yeah.
And so it creates a kind of an acceptance. And the other thing is that these shows serve a purpose of allowing people to feel like they are connected to what's going on, and they allow them to feel like things are okay. Because if these kinds of shows are on, if you can get home after a long day and say 11 o'clock at night or something, turn these things on and have a good chuckle at somebody seemingly railing against the system for a little bit, you feel like, okay, I've done my part, he's done his part, everything is pretty much okay. And, of course, everything isn't okay, and the things that they don't talk about on those shows are horrific and mammoth and explosive. And those are the things that we want to talk about. Those are the things that we want to look into and that we want to get to the bottom of.
Yeah, no, I completely agree. I think that there is something like we were talking about the Blackwater guy on The Daily Show. It's the same thing. Like as evil and as corrupt and as bad as a person as I know he is, there is something about the psychology of seeing a very human part of him where he's having a casual conversation, laughing, that it's like, it really does has a psychological effect on you where you're like, oh, he doesn't seem that bad, and it's like, and all of a sudden everything you've ever read about him and all the bad things you've ever read about Blackwater, having to change their name multiple times and all this stuff because they've been kicked out of countries and all of a sudden you're like, oh, they don't seem that bad, and you're like, what the fuck is going on with me? Like, why do I feel this way? And then you, like you said, it does make them more human, and I think that's a huge issue. I also think, like, the thing you're talking about, free time. I have a theory about this because the sports thing, I completely agree. I think that people do spend too much time focusing on mindless entertainment, and especially like in 2014 where we have basically free education by just going online. You could read up about absolutely anything and learn about any subject, any topic you would like. You can read up on it where 100 years ago you couldn't. If you didn't have money, you didn't go to a good university, you were screwed. That's it. And today you don't. That's not the case. And but I do think there's a link between materialism and mindless entertainment with income equality and our unhappiness in our lives. Because I think we spend most of our time doing things we dislike and things we hate, and we don't spend enough time doing things we do like. And I think because of it, so you spend most of your life, most of your energy, most of your time, most of your best years working for some corporate monster, and who could care less about you. And then, when you get home, the little energy you have left, you're just like, you know what? I'm just going to put on something mindless. And it's because you don't have the energy to I guess, maybe focus on something or research something or read something. And so I think that, even though a lot of people look at sports and are like, oh, you're wasting your time, I think a lot of it, and also materialism. I think materialism, even though, it all goes back to, Edward Bernays and the nephew of Sigmund Freud and the way they convince us, with public relations and propaganda to buy things and kind of poke at our desires and wants. And I also think it has a lot to do with the fact that the way we live today, we just, like I said, we spend so much time doing things we have to do, our adult chores and going to work we don't spend any time just thinking or self-reflecting or really just questioning things. And because of it, I think because we're so unhappy, we do end up buying the big screen TV that, to watch the game on Sunday to make us feel at least happy for a little bit. Or when your work day sucks, you do look forward to watching the game when you get home because it's like, at least I have something to look forward to. So I think that, like, all these things are just an issue because the life we live right now, people are just unhappy. That's why everybody's on antidepressant, and that's why Big Pharma is making a living off selling these things. And I think alcohol sales are always stay consistent because if you get fired, hey, let's go have a drink, I'm depressed. And if you get promoted, you're like, hey, let's go celebrate, let's go have a drink. So you always have a reason to drink. And so I think that that is a big part of it. And I also think you look at it like, when for a long time before we had technology, if you I'm sure, and this isn't backed by any real I guess theory besides my own theory, but it seems like a long time ago, when you had free time, you spend time reading, you spend time talking to your friends, socializing, you spend time sharing ideas, all this stuff, and that's what you had for free time. And that's, you maybe did some artistic thing, like wrote music or painted. And today it's like when people have free time, they go on Facebook. They watch silly cat YouTube videos. It's like it's one of those things where just like, so I think because of all this technology and all this mindless entertainment at our fingertips, like instead of having, using it for good, we use it for mindless stuff. And then, and it's what we're doing with our free time, I think, is a big issue too, where before we had all this, I think for when my parents were growing up, my grandparents were growing up, their free time spent around friends, which usually spark conversation, which sometimes can be some good conversations and bouncing ideas off each other. Now you can just go online and Google the things that back your view, and that's it. And then be convinced that you're right, or you have the story set in stone because you just looked at the sites that kind of back your point of view. So do you think is there anything to that, or is that, possibly?
Well, I think you've said it all.
Next question. I'm kidding. But yeah. So yeah, sorry for the rant. But you had anything to add to that?
Not really. I agree with most of it, if not all.
Okay. And so let's get to your book and some. Well, actually, let's get to obviously I'm passionate about these things. What sets the the flame in you? What makes you burn? What motivates you to want to research this stuff? Was there anything when you're really young? I see the Orwell book behind you, but is there any books, or any documentary that really, I guess, caused the awakening, for lack of a better term, that really like changed your perspective and really said like, holy shit, like I want to investigate more, I want to learn more, because it seems like things aren't what they seem? Is there anything that sticks out that really was that thing?
Not really. I mean, my own formation was, I had the benefit of parents who were reasonably wise and active and cared, and so I grew up in that kind of an environment. So this sort of thing was not. It was sort of normal for me to be interested and to care, to follow what was going on, and to be active and looking for solutions. So that, I think, was one thing. But what I have found is that there have been certain moments in my life where something will dawn on me, and it's not so much from reading or watching things. It's more, I would say, I've always been a kind of you might say a free thinker, and I've always tried to push myself to be like that, to kind of look at things and try to not think about them in the way that other people are thinking about them, but to try to train myself to think in an organic way. And when I was in my early days as a reporter, I instinctively, when all the reporters were together sort of at a press conference, I instinctively pulled myself back a little bit and tried to figure out were we on a stage already? Like the Truman Show, the movie. Yeah. Were we on a stage? Were the questions even the right ones? What was the context? What was happening? Who was hosting the press conference? And why were they the people presenting to us? And so another thing I did was, very early on, I began seeing that it was a good idea to go in the opposite direction of the crowd. And I did that in my first work as a journalist, and I do that today, that people are always telling you, hey, what about this, and why don't you do that? And I know, for example, people who don't even really look at our website, Who, What, Why, will say, hey, did you hear there's a big new news website coming out, and they got tons of money, and they hired so-and-so. And I feel sorry for these people, because they're so their whole life is sort of driven by the latest hot thing as defined by others. And I sort of don't care. I mean, I haven't read a lot of the books that everybody's talking about. I haven't watched a lot of movies they're talking about. It's not that I'm not interested in books and movies, but I kind of pick books and movies that at the moment seem to fill a need for me, seem to answer a question or delve into a subject that I'm interested in at that time. And then I do a little bit of pop culture. And I have to say, honestly, the less of that you do, the more you discover that it's not all that rewarding, that maybe the best-selling book, the person was on Charlie Rose, or the game that everybody's talking about, maybe it's not all that great. And so I just don't worry about these things. And I agree with you. You did say this earlier in your extended comments, that there was a time when you would just make your own happiness, and very simple games that you can play with children, sitting with other adults and maybe enjoying a glass of wine or something, and having a kind of just a really fun, relaxed chat about whatever is on anyone's mind. This is a beautiful thing. It's a wonderful thing. And so I think journalism can be the same thing, where you really enjoy it. You can't wait to get out of bed in the morning. This is what I do every day. I get out of bed and I say, boy, I can't wait to get going. I say, what do I want to tackle today? And I'm out and about, and I'll talk to a doctor, and they'll complain about the insurance companies and how they can't give the kind of care they want to. And I'll say, well, that's really interesting. I mean, we've heard this, but how come there isn't more coverage about it, and why is nothing being done? So I'll ask them questions. I'll start taking notes, and there I go on a story. I mean, I really think great journalism is organic. You mentioned Michael Hastings. I mean, Michael Hastings, if you ask most people now, they've forgotten who he was. Just 2 or 3 years ago, this guy was on cloud nine. He was very much the up-and-coming hot journalist of the United States that everybody was talking about. And he had broken several very big stories, and now he was working on movie deals, and, Rolling Stone, all these places that hired him. And here he was working on all these important stories, And we now know that he had said that he felt he was being investigated by the national security state. He told a neighbor he felt there was something wrong with his car, and he wondered if someone had been tampering with it, and on and on and on. And this is all in a day or two period. And then his car supposedly goes out of control, runs into a tree, and explodes, and he's dead. Now, there was no other car involved. There's no explanation. He was on a straight street. He wasn't on some, windy, curvy thing. Where was he going? It was the wee hours. No indication that he had been drinking. What was going on there? Why do we just say, okay, if the government tells us this was an accident, that's it? Why do we not do our own detective work? And so whowhatwhy.com, our website, we did do some work, not enough. We did some. Obtained video footage from a pizza parlor across the street. It shows the crash. Talked to some people about it. Did a little bit of sort of forensic work and trying to figure out if what we were told is normal and makes sense. Now, we hope to do more, but I should explain we are a small nonprofit. We don't even take ads. And so everything we do is entirely based on donations from ordinary people. And sadly, like I'm sure this is the case with you and with most smaller entities, the vast majority of the people who love what we do don't ever give anything. I would say more than 99% of our regular readers have never given a penny. Maybe we need to do a better job or be more aggressive of pitching them. But the fact is that if you want really good information that can help you understand your world, navigate it, protect whatever freedom you have left, you have to be willing to support those who are going to go out on your behalf and dig. But in any case, so we did what we could on that. All these other stories, we're always looking for the stories that just seem to be crying out for investigation, and yet, sort of bizarrely, others are not looking at them at all. I'm always fascinated by the enthusiasm with which the media embraces whatever the establishment tells them, even after having done so many stories where they had to report that the establishment had lied, had deceived.
Yeah, the Michael Hastings thing is very interesting because, I mean, cars today kind of monitor everything that happens in that car. And Mercedes, I think, still hasn't come to any conclusion on what happened, right?
Well, I think Mercedes thinks that there was something wrong with that and that was not the normal way that a Mercedes would behave. But you see, there's a problem, and this gets into us all being scared. Mercedes doesn't want to be labeled conspiracy nuts. It's not good for their brand. I mean, their customers are mostly wealthy people who are part of the establishment, so Mercedes cannot afford to make trouble. And I'm sure they had all kinds of internal meetings, and maybe some whistleblower will leak some of that to us. It would be nice. We'd love to know what happened, because obviously it's not good for them to have the public think that their cars aren't safe. And their cars are relatively safe, safer than most. And so I think they would have loved to be out there talking about this. But we've seen this before in other cases. We were virtually alone in covering some of these Middle Eastern adventures in the wake of Arab Spring with Libya, the ousting of Gaddafi. We were virtually alone among news organizations in the United States and even the world in questioning whether the West really went in there to protect the Libyan people, or there was some other agenda more consistent with the typical reasons that people and countries go to war, which is usually self-interest. It's usually resources. It's usually other things. And so we looked into that, and in that story, there was a steady drumbeat of vilification of Gaddafi, which was never examined as to whether it was even true or not. And one of those was that he was ordering his troops to commit mass rape. Now, this was reported almost everywhere, including even the so-called liberal media. Good journalistic outfits like The Guardian reported that he supposedly was encouraging mass rape. immediately, the first thing that went through my mind, because I always try to put myself in the shoes of the person you're writing about, I said, if I were the leader of a small, vulnerable country, and the most powerful countries in the world were looking to overthrow me and basically kill me, what would I do? And the first thing I thought about was I would not decide to turn my people against me at that moment by having their sisters, daughters, wives raped by my soldiers. That doesn't seem a productive course of action. I thought there's no way he would do that. I'm not saying that rape is not part of war. It certainly is. It's often the act of individual soldiers, but you also have to remember that Libya is a Muslim country. I mean, a rape is a crime in a different way than it's a crime in the West, and it's an extra reason to question whether the soldiers were doing it, whether their superiors were ordering them to do that, and so forth. And the reason where I'm getting about in a very long and roundabout way was that they later, when that story ran out of steam and they needed to keep basically pissing off people in the West so they would support a growing and more aggressive military action in that country, they then began ramping it up. So then they said, oh, and we're finding the soldiers were issued condoms, which I find sort of funny because it just seems unlikely that if you're raping and pillaging that you're stopping to put a condom on. And then they said the third thing, which was they were giving them Viagra. And I again thought, do 19-year-old soldiers really need Viagra? I don't know. I kind of doubt it. But we did talk to Viagra. We talked to the people who make it. And they told us privately that the story was ludicrous and that they knew for a fact that they could sort of look at their wholesale and their distribution, and there wasn't nearly enough in that region for Gaddafi to even have had it without them knowing about it, which made sense to me. But did they go public with that? They did not, because, again, they don't want trouble, and they're selling an establishment product, and they need the cooperation of the U.S. government, authorities, and so on. So nobody wants to make us think about these things, and we never get the truth, or rarely.
Yeah, and it's funny because even the Iraq thing, Operation Iraq Liberation stands for oil, Operation Iraqi Liberation, and I wonder if that's like a little like punch in the gut to like, hey, we're gonna make it so obvious, you idiots, that you're not even gonna pick up on it, you know? And but yeah, it's so true. It's amazing how little people in America understand what happens in the rest of the world. Like we're like this. I guess more mild version of like North Korea, where just like, you know, the government controls the media and a lot of it has to do with what we talked about, how people just don't have time to research and stuff like that. And then so what do? You put on the news for like 5 minutes before you pass out on your bed, before you have to wake up at 5 a.m, and then whatever propaganda that they're selling you just kind of soak it in, and that's your view on that, you know, on that news story. So it's unfortunate because, you know, people in Europe and other places do seem like they have a better understanding of the history in the Middle East and our history in the Middle East. Everything from like, I mean, people. Well,
it's completely different. I was living in Belgrade, Serbia, of all places, when the invasion of Iraq began, and I had satellite television. I was monitoring the different channels. I could get, for example, CNN, Fox, but I could also get something called Euro News, and I could get BBC, and I could get other channels. There was no RT at that point, I don't think. But one of the things that struck me was how different these shows were. Fox, of course, extremely jingoistic, lots of flags, lots of patriotic music. CNN, less so, but only by degrees. But when you watch, say, Euronews, which just ran kind of raw footage, you were like, oh, my God, this just feels very different. And you would see, you know, the Western ones were all embedded with American and Western troops, and they tend to be very favorable to them and to see it through their eyes. And they would constantly, you know, withhold certain stories and footage because they didn't want to make any problems for the troops. Of course, that's not journalism. I mean, why call yourself a journalist if you're going to do that? These other channels would just run this raw footage, and you would see completely different kind of things. You would see much more carnage. You'd see many, many more innocent people killed in the most gruesome ways. So yeah, I mean, we have a very, very different sense of this. It's extremely important. You see, in a country like the United States, where we are told that we live in a democracy, it's extremely important that they keep up this fiction of the consent of the governed. And so, because we do vote and we do have a certain influence in certain things, it's very important that our perceptions be shaped so that we approve the things that those who govern us want to do anyway. That's really what it's all about. And so if you go to the military academies, they have these courses in psychological operations, hearts and minds, the importance of, they always spin it as, how important it is to get the public behind us and so forth, to support our troops. I was just reading that Bruce Springsteen and a bunch of other people are going to be going and doing these concerts to sort of honor our troops. But, I mean, what for? I mean, the truth of the matter is that obviously in a fair and a just war, you want to honor people who risk their lives. But if those people themselves are dupes, have been tricked, maybe were in economic circumstances where they had no choice but to go, or they were the victims of propaganda, were made to feel that they somehow would be, for example, more manly or better people if they served in the military. That's a tragedy, and they're victims too. And to when you go and you sort of serenade them and talk all the time about our troops, and in this country, you can't go to a ball game or a concert or anything without that kind of propaganda. And the sad thing about it is if you say the things I'm saying, you get attacked by people who say, well, you're ungrateful. But even those people are victims, and there's these spots in their brain that are being triggered, and they immediately think that you're a pinko or something like that, especially in certain parts of the country. They don't understand that they've been manipulated and brainwashed so long that they themselves are made to feel that all of these things they do through their own lives are supposed to be unexamined behavior, swearing allegiance, putting your hand over your heart, singing certain songs. These are not the happy acts of free, independent thinking individuals. And, I'm as proud of my country as anyone, but I'm not just uniformly proud of it even when it does terrible things. I'm proud of it when it does good things. But more, I would say, I'm proud of all kinds of things. I'm proud of civilization when it does good things. I'm proud of the current people who live on Earth. And, those of us who travel, the more you travel, the more you discover that people are people. And if you really think about it, I live in New York City. You get on the subway and somebody jostles you, somebody's rude or whatever. And, then we're supposed to pretend that we're all in it together, that we all love each other. Our bank screws us, this and that. We get robbed by our countrymen. So to sort of blandly state that we're all Americans and we're all in it together and ignore all of these other things and discount the fact that when you travel you can meet people anywhere and you can see how wonderful people anywhere can be, people who speak a different language, who look differently. That's the truth, and that's kind of what the establishment in our country doesn't want us to know, because as the joke goes, join the Marines, travel to exotic places, meet exotic people, and kill them.
Yeah.
If we were to think more about that, we wouldn't want to do it, and many more of us would become pacifists, and we try to find out what the wars are about. As you pointed out, oil. I mean, that's a very interesting thing. With these wars, like with Libya, with Syria, with Ukraine, they have all these different justifications ready to go. They cater different justifications to women, to men, to the south, to the north, to the poor, to the rich. Everybody's told a slightly different story because all of this stuff is figured out by psychologists and PR people, very, very smart tactically and strategically. And the truth of the matter is that any of these things could be used to convince us. I mean, look, OIL. I don't doubt that is at least a subliminal message, because the truth of the matter is they always tell us that we're going in for honorable reasons because that makes us feel better, and it's a better external message. But what if they told us, listen, we're going in for oil because we need oil, because you need oil, because you want to drive your SUV all over the place, you want to live far from where grocery stores are and so on, you want to go places the weekend and go to the ball game and so on, you need oil and we need to get it for you. Frankly, that's probably a very potent argument for these wars, but they're afraid to do that because that puts us in this incredibly self-centered and difficult situation where we have to decide who we are as people, and then we start saying, yeah, I do want to drive my car, but couldn't I drive my car without the oil? And then this starts getting into all these issues of getting away, weaning ourselves from fossil fuels and what have you, and at that point you got the oil companies getting angry and putting tremendous pressure on the government, saying, no, don't tell people we're going in there for oil. We don't want that. And then they can't.
Yeah, absolutely. And that's why I think it's interesting. That's why history it really was intriguing to me, because even when I really got, I guess, intrigued with conspiracy theories, there was something sexy about discovering the unknown, but I think the more intriguing thing was the fact that there's a lot of truth to a lot of these things. And even in this theory that from the outside looks kind of silly, then you start discovering, holy shit, well, this part of the theory is true, and that part, and this guy's a part of it, and that guy's and then you start finding all these links and you connect the dots, and you realize that you actually do end up learning about historical events and historical figures and all this stuff. And I mean, you look at, Iran, when Iran had their first democratically elected, president and or prime minister, and then the U.S. government ended up going in there to take him down because he wanted to nationalize the oil, and I think it was BP, whatever they were before BP, with the other name that they had initially, and then they basically got cahoots with the U.S. government. They took him down, all this stuff. So it's funny because it happened in the 1950s, I believe. It's almost like you could tell the story and people are like, oh yeah, that's crazy. No, and I'm like, wait, yeah, that's crazy because it happened a long time ago. But what makes you think that the same government that did that couldn't do things today? And I think there's something about, I've heard you in the past talk about the Boston bombing and talk about more current events, Michael Hastings, and I think it's funny because you're right. People do look at you like, oh, that's crazy, or that's conspiracy theorists. But when we talk about basically the same type of corruption, maybe even to a bigger degree, but it happened a long time ago, it's easier for people to soak it in and be like, oh yeah, that is crazy. And it's like, well, what makes you think that just because it happened a long time ago can't happen today? And I think there is something about it happening, in a long time ago, that we detach it. We think that it's not the same type of government. We think it's not the same type of people. But you end up putting these links together and you realize, I remember even when I started your book, you hit on the Bushes and you hit on all the links they had to everybody else, and that was really intriguing. All these really powerful families, the people who they worked with and people that worked under them and they worked over and this stuff, and how they end up becoming presidents, and this person, and it's and there's all these links, so you realize it really is a giant mafia. And so, well, let's talk about Iran, for example. In my book, Family of Secrets, I talk about Iran, and Iran is a classic case of where what the public was told at the time was that the Mossadegh was overthrown domestically, but actually the Anglo-American Oil Company was in there, and the backup story was that the Brits wanted to get rid of him, and the U.S. helped them out. The real story is it was the U.S. running the whole show. Not to say the Brits weren't in there, but the U.S. and Alan Dulles and the CIA very much running that whole thing. And then you see links between the people who ran that and the coup in Guatemala and the coup in Chile and the Bay of Pigs invasion, and guess what? The assassination of John F. Kennedy. The same people show up in very peculiar circumstances close to the action. And so then people go, well, come on, what are you saying about Kennedy? Well, let me ask this question. Almost every president of the United States has either been shot, killed or survived, or somebody tried to shoot at them, or tried to commit some other
violent act relating to them. Now, on our website, Who, What, Why, you could read about all these things going on where the Secret Service slips up, screws up somehow, like they did with Kennedy, and all of these things happen. Obama has been threatened again and again and again by security breaches of all kinds. And, some of them are maybe kooks, but let's think about this logically. Presidents are put in by the most powerful, wealthiest interests in this country, if not the world. They feel obliged to listen to them and to appoint people who these institutions want. And then what happens when they start breaking away and doing their own thing and really being president? What happens? Do these interests simply say, okay, you know what, we invested tens of millions of dollars in this person and we made them who they are, a Jimmy Carter plucked from obscurity, or a Bill Clinton, and then put in as the king, so to speak, then they're just going to let them do whatever they want, even if it threatens their interest? That makes no sense at all. And so when you look at the entire history of the United States and these hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of security breaches and threats or attempted assassinations, we are told that in 100% of those cases, it was a lone wolf, a nut, a disgruntled person, and never, ever, in any of these cases, over the course of a couple of hundred years, was there ever a powerful institution, a company, an organization, a group, whoever thought that they would want to harm, remove, or otherwise weaken the president. Now, if you go and you look at the coups around the world, they're always companies and organizations and networks who do it. So we must just be incredibly dumb because our media and our academia, our textbook publishers, the talk shows, they all pretend that all of these things are lone nuts. And we put up with that. And we allow people who actually question or investigate these things to be vilified as cuckoo. I mean, who's cuckoo? The people who question these things, or the society that makes them out to be nuts instead of listening to them, talking to them, studying the material that they dig up, and then ultimately sort of respecting and maybe even honoring them?
Yeah, absolutely. And you brought up Alan Dulles, and I think he's an interesting fellow because just the links between him being appointed to the commission report and or the Warren Commission, I mean, and this guy was the head of CIA, was fired by Kennedy, and he was the head of Operation Ajax. He was a big part of, I believe, the Bay of Pigs and all this stuff, which obviously they blame Kennedy for being a failure. And now this guy gets appointed to the Warren Commission, and to me, that's insanity. I mean, that's insane that a guy that Kennedy fired end up being a part of the investigation of his death. And the thing about the Kennedy assassination is, I truly believe there was like an overthrow of government, because you look at all the links between Alan Dulles and then the Bushes and Gerald Ford, I believe, on the Warren Commission too.
Yes, he was.
Yeah, he was. So all these people who end up, and LBJ obviously, and who all benefited from the JFK assassination. It's amazing that people don't look at it and be like, holy shit, your site is Who, What, Why. I think those are important, even though it sounds silly. Those are such important questions because motive and why and who and what, all these things are just basic questions that a lot of times we never ask. And I think that we end up taking in the official story, and we don't ever think of what was the motive and who would have.
Well, let's talk about the Kennedy thing because in my book Family of Secrets, it was supposed to be about the Bush family. Originally, I was going to write about George W. I began to realize that his improbable rise could not be explained without understanding his father. And then when I studied the father, I found that his rise was improbable. And then I found all these odd things around the father. And the more I dug, the more I realized that we knew very, very little about this family when we elected them president, and even after they left the White House. And to this day, the public is completely in the dark and is victimized by a mythology about these people. And as I dug, I found that the Bush family was part of these big networks that were involved with all these coups, that Allen Dulles was tantamount to a business partner of George W. Bush's grandfather, that they were all working with the same banks and the same oil companies and went to the same schools and, intermarried and so forth. This is really not dissimilar to when you go down to a place like El Salvador and you have what they will call the 100 families or something that really run the country. It's really quite similar. And so my research for Family of Secrets took me into places where I never expected to go. Why, when you write a book about the Bush family, would you possibly have 5 chapters of all new material on the JFK assassination? And the answer is that the more I studied George H.W. Bush, the father, Bush 41, the more I found that his being director of the CIA for a single year as a supposed outsider with no qualifications or experience, just like it seems, doesn't make any sense. And the answer was it didn't make any sense unless you knew that the official story was false, that he was not an outsider, that he himself, what I dug up was that he had an extensive background working in the intelligence services while operating with a cover of being a diplomat and an oil man and a congressman and a vice president and a president. In other words, the United States got a president who was secretly working for the police, the security police, while he was in the White House. Now, that's a pretty big story. That means we don't really understand the nature of our own purported democracy, how these things work. We don't understand how he got on the ticket with Reagan, who was his opponent. We don't understand why it was that it was a friend of the Bush family who shot Ronald Reagan. I mean, this is just one of those weird facts.
Yeah, wasn't one of the brothers, right, was going to have, one of the Bush brothers was going to have, I think,
was supposed to have dinner that night with Neil Bush. What is that all about? Weird coincidence? Maybe, maybe not. But you've got to look at all this stuff. And so I began digging deeper and deeper and deeper, and the Kennedy assassination, something I frankly knew very little about, had never really read about, and hadn't taken an interest in. Like most people, I had some vague notion that there was a lot of controversy around it, but I guess I thought maybe Oswald had done it. But I began having to look at the Kennedy assassination because I was trying to figure out why George H.W. Bush couldn't remember where he was on the day that Kennedy was shot. And I thought, well, that's bizarre. I guess I had to at least figure out where he was. And so I spent years just looking into that stuff. And that's why Family of Secrets became largely about the Bush family, but the Bush family in the context of major national and global traumas like the Kennedy assassination, like Watergate, like Iran-Contra, like all of these things. And I began to discover that all of these things have connections, that they're part of larger patterns, that there's a predictability and an inevitability and a logic to these things. And so as soon as you start discovering those things and you want to explain it, immediately your microphone gets cut off. You're not invited onto those shows. They don't want you to be able to say this, because if the public were to learn, there's a possibly apocryphal story where George H.W. Bush is talking to a reporter, and he says to her, Sarah, if the public ever learned what we had done, they would chase us down the street and string us up. Now, I don't know if he actually really said that or not, never been able to verify it, but I suppose in an unguarded moment he might have confessed that the public has absolutely no idea, because the news business itself, even the better news organizations, it's a fantasy. You see, even the stuff that you see on the right wing or the left wing, supposed right wing or left wing shows, are fantasies. The elections are a fantasy. The left right divide is a fantasy. The hot button issues that we get all worked up are a fantasy. All these things are designed to keep us from focusing on why is it that 99% of us don't have more than 1%. Why is it that we're constantly victimized, that we can work hard all our lives? We're being told we get a pension, and then the pension gets taken away, and whoop, too bad. Why is it that we have a house and we thought it was secure, and then suddenly we discovered that there was something called a collateralized mortgage obligation that we never heard of, that all of these things, that the government doesn't regulate any of these things, that we can lose our health insurance because we need it, that, you have a prior condition, then you can't have health insurance, all these things that make no sense, that in no just and decent society would any of these things take place, that Germany, which is like well on its way to creating a totally sustainable energy situation with, wind and solar and all these things. I mean, for God's sake, go to Germany. It's cloudy all the time, and they're using solar. In our country, we're like, it's the last laugh is on us because we were told, this stuff is not feasible. And then you'd go out there and you go to, a dinner or go out to a bar and be talking to people, and they'd say, well, that's not feasible. Well, how do they know? Well, I know it because I heard it or I read it, or, well, where did you hear it or where do you read it? Your own sources of information are poisoned, you see. And this is really why I started Who, What, Why, because I thought the public deserves something better, and we're going to make a try at it.
Yeah, absolutely. And to talk about Allen Dulles, I can't stop talking about the JFK assassination because it's just so intriguing. Like everything from, him. I mean, he was a part of the MK Ultra project too, I believe. I think that was during when he was.
Yes, we actually wrote about MK Ultra on Who, What, Why. If you go there and just type in MKULTRA, that was a mind control experimentation program led by the Central Intelligence Agency under Allen Dulles in the 1950s. And they were testing things like, could you create a Manchurian candidate? Could you brainwash or hypnotize or use psychotropic drugs to get people to do things against their will? And of course, as we see all these cases where people go and attack the White House and or do this or do that, and they get shot or they get killed, why would they do it? Why do people shoot up movie theaters seemingly for no reason? Are there that many crazy, violent people who just so many more now than there were in the past because there's a surge of this? Nobody asks these questions, or very few do. And we need to study MK Ultra, and we need to read the testimony from the Church Committee back in the 1970s, where the people in the CIA were forced, they actually had to come and testify and admit all these kooky things and, poisoned umbrellas and what have you. I mean, there are these giant establishments to this day are full of laboratories and researchers and so on, and their job is to create the stuff. And there's other thousands of people whose jobs are to go out and use these things and to create Manchurian candidates, and to not even discuss this stuff in the media, and it's never discussed, again tells us that the game is rigged. They're not interested in getting to the bottom of any of these things.
Yeah. MK Ultra was a pretty crazy thing because there was declassified documents and stuff like that. This wasn't just a conspiracy theory. This was actual project, funded by taxpayers' money to, like you said, mind control. They experiment with the LSD and all these things. And you talked about the Bushes. The other thing that was really intriguing, I remember, was learning about Prescott Bush and, him being a part of, what was it called? The United Bank, I believe, from out of New York. And, there's a lot of people.
There were Brown Brothers Harriman was their investment banking firm, but during World War II, prior to World War II, and then in World War II, I think what you're talking about, the Union Bank.
That's what it was. Yeah.
Union Banking Company, what they did was they did a lot of business with German bankers and industrialists prior to World War II. Those Germans, just like American financiers and so on, backed the candidate they thought they could control. His name, Adolf Hitler. And so when things went bad, when things went south, they, of course, realized they had to get their money out there, and there was Prescott Bush and his colleagues only too happy to help them move that money, hide that money, and so forth. And there was actually a congressional investigation of this, and they concluded that basically these people had exhibited a traitorous behavior in wartime by enabling these Nazi financiers to hide their money, but they got a slap on the wrist. they all survived, and Prescott Bush, who had been a banker, went on to become a United States Senator, and more, he became one of the leading members of the the Senate Armed Services Committee, ironically, being seen as a great patriot and encouraging the U.S. to go into more wars. So, I mean, we don't. Yes, I agree with what you said earlier in the program, which is that we need to study history because otherwise we're destined to repeat it. That all of the things that are going on now have antecedents, and we need to understand those things.
Yeah. The Union Banking Corporation actually got seized by the trading with, I think it was Trading with the Enemy Act or something like that. There was actually, like you said, because I know I've heard people in the past say, oh, that link between Bush and the Nazis is bullshit and all that stuff. I'm like, no, they actually got seized, for like you said, for trading with, hiding money for the Nazis and stuff like that. And he also was a part of, I think, Planned Parenthood. He had some links to Margaret Sanger and the founder of Planned Parenthood, and he was a big part of that, which a lot of people know Margaret. For people who don't know, Margaret Sanger is a kind of a known eugenics lover and kind of known as a racist, and she opened the very first planned or I think it was a birth control clinic in Harlem, and it was in Harlem, and I believe all her employees were African American. So so there's a lot of links between.
Yeah, I mean the whole issue, for example, of abortion, which is now used to divide people. Back in the early days, as you're talking about with the eugenics movement and so forth, these were basically wealthy white Americans who believed that white, largely Protestant, but then Christian, were superior, and that it was urgent that the other peoples of the country and of the world not be able to multiply too much and overwhelm the good white people. And Planned Parenthood did come out of that background. Now, to be fair, what its function today is very, very different, and the leadership is a very different composition. But it is true in the early days, and Prescott Bush and his friends, they were involved with a whole bunch of institutions. They were involved with the Sloan Kettering Cancer Institute. They were involved with the American Museum of Natural History, which also had roots, again, in sort of eugenics, because they were very interested in anthropology to sort of study the Ubermensch. And, really a lot of the values of the Nazis came out of the United States, actually, and you can read good books on this. There's some very fine documentaries on these topics. There's one made by someone I know. It's called War Against the Weak, I believe, a terrific documentary about the eugenics movement. This was going on in New York City and on Long Island. It wasn't going on in Germany. And actually, at that time, Germany was a rather liberal country. People don't realize this. Under the Weimar Republic, doing some very, very good things, actually, prior to Hitler's rise.
Yeah, there's another one called, I think, Mafa 21, and it's kind of I think it was made by like some pro-life guy, but it does go to the history of eugenics and how it kind of was founded by a racist, and a lot of the background of it seems like their goal was to stop minorities, mostly Latinos and African Americans from having kids, and so it is interesting when you research this stuff, and it does seem crazy because you think Planned Parenthood, like you said today. To be fair, today it definitely doesn't seem like that's the goal of it. But when you find out that one of the founding members of and opened the first birth control clinic was a racist, that's pretty insane. And so also LBJ, that's another thing that I think a lot of people don't realize how ruthless he was. And from Mac Wallace and then all the murders that were, I believe he was going to be
because you just suddenly switched from one subject to another. So I just wanted to finish up on and I do want to say that, I mean, today and for many, many years, whatever one thinks of abortion, and it's an undesirable thing to say the least, there really does serve unwed mothers, people who can't cope, who can't handle kids, and so forth. And so it really is a different thing. But what I think is very, very important is to recall the roots of these things and understand, for example, that today there's a kind of parallel to that mentality of we don't want the colored peoples of the country to have too many kids and have too much power, and that is the modern voter fraud movement, where this is really put out, I have to say, by the Republican Party, which is very concerned about the fact that black people and Latinos and so on tend to vote Democratic, and so it's vote suppression. And they're always talking about people voting, and they don't have ID and they shouldn't be voting. All of the data that we have indicate that voter fraud is so limited as to be almost non-existent. In other words, this is just not, do people commit fraud for financial gain? Yes, but there isn't a lot of gain that's so obvious to go and vote one more time. I mean, maybe if people were organized and 1 million people had together agreed that they would each do that would be something else. But that people on their own are sort of going and risking getting in trouble and so forth to do that, never been any evidence that was real, except where there were organized in the machines, and those were sort of in Chicago and places like that, or just like with the Communist Party in the Eastern Bloc, where people would all have to go vote and show that they voted and who they voted for. So this is kind of nonsense, and so that's a kind of a fake thing. The much more real threat is that elections can be stolen through messing with the electronic voting, and that more likely would swing the other way and benefit the others. I'm sorry, you wanted to talk about LBJ. I'm happy to do that.
No, that's okay, because I think that's an important issue, and I was just I was either listening or reading something earlier today about a similar thing about how they were saying that voter fraud is such a small issue that the attention they're putting on it is quite obvious that the Republicans know the less people who show up to vote, the better chance they are of winning, and it seems like that's the link. And it seems like they're harassing minorities and people, young people and minorities and people who either lost their license or doesn't drive or whatever. And I think it's one of those things where it's kind of, from the outside looking in, you would think, oh yeah, this makes sense. But then when you realize the strategy behind it and the statistics that don't prove that it's an issue, I just think that it's and especially with voting season coming and all this stuff, I think it's an important topic. And I think people need to realize that it is just a strategy to win an election, and so it's not a real issue. At least nothing that I've read have proven it so far. So I agree.
Yeah, and it's all, the other thing that it does is it gets the stalwarts. I mean, typically, and I've covered politics for many years, typically Republicans are more likely to vote than Democrats. And so this is yet another incentive for their stalwarts. If they can be convinced, places like Fox News exist for propaganda purposes, to get people worked up and then to make sure that a really high percentage of that base votes. And so one of the ways they do that is by convincing them and getting them all juiced up that, some black guy is going to go vote twice. So, hey, honey, we better get out there and make sure that every kid and all of our neighbors all get out and vote and make sure that doesn't happen. And then it kind of works like it did in Florida in 2000, and I guess in 2004, where there were all these stories of police and sheriff's deputies just out there in force, stopping every African American who might have had one tail light out or something, and detaining them long enough that they then were late for work and they didn't go and vote. And I think there's real evidence that occurred. So these are things that stymie democracy, and they're very, very serious.
Yeah, I just heard something too about a bunch of people. I don't know what state they were voting in, but something about like all these African Americans were saying that they were going a second time to vote and that they can't vote, and they're like, no, we haven't voted yet, and so stuff like that does happen, and that's the thing. I think this goes to the bigger issue. Like I kind of I know people say, oh, you if you don't vote then you shouldn't complain, this and that, but honestly, you're picking between until they really have a third party. They let them get into debates. Obviously, the debates are run by the two political parties, the Republicans and Democrats. We have one more option than a dictatorship. I mean, a dictatorship has one, we have two. It's like this McDonald's, Burger King, Coca-Cola, Pepsi thing, where it's like as long as you have two, you feel like you you have some power into what happens, and then you have a choice, and you really don't. And it's funny how like one president will do a really shitty job. Then I remember watching the Oliver Stone documentary. I don't know what to call it, but it's a video series of the untold history of the United States, and just seeing like Truman and seeing all these old presidents, and they all use the same slogans and logos, like, oh, vote for me, change, this and that, because it's like one political party will do a shitty job, so then you think voting for the other one will help. Then that one does a shitty job, then you vote for the other one. And it's just like we have this like short-term memory where we can't remember that, like, holy crap, we've already voted them in too, and they didn't do anything. And then also look at the fact that, you talked about the Bush families. Look at the last 20 years. Look at look at the names that have been presidents. They've all have links to each other. Most of them have, it looks like most of them are going to be Clintons and Bushes. And so it just, there is, I think we have to get it through our head that we need a third party, even if it is just to kind of mix things up and whatnot, because obviously this two political party thing is just silly. They both, I think Obama is a perfect example, because I was tricked. I was convinced he was a great, when he told his speech and this and that, I'm like, wow, this guy really seems personable, and he seems like his heart's in the right place. And then I don't know what got into me thinking that he was gonna do anything different, but he's obviously, it hasn't changed at all. Drone attacks to prosecuting whistleblowers to whatever. He's been just as bad as Bush, minus the September 11th thing under his belt, and Katrina, or the lack of response in Katrina. But I think that, I don't know what your opinion on voting is, but do you believe in voting, or is that also one of those things like me where you're just like, until you give me a third option and something that's worth voting for, it doesn't seem worth it?
No, I do believe in voting, and there are real substantive differences between the Democratic Party, the Republican Party. There are real substantive differences between these candidates, but the biggest issues, the largest issues, which really are war, the military economy, the regulation or lack thereof of Wall Street, of large corporations, of pharmaceutical companies, of insurance companies, and on and on. The control, the consolidation of the media, and the tolerance of that by the FCC. These things, there are only marginal differences. The differences come in other areas. Typically, their court appointments are different. They have different views of civil liberties. They have different views, to some extent, of economic incentives, of taxation, and what have you. There are of the role of the government in providing inspection services. Typically, Republican presidents have cut far back on things like poultry inspections, sanitary health inspections, things like that. So there are real differences between Democrats and Republicans, and that's why I would always vote. But I agree with you that without a third party, we don't have a really vigorous debate. They don't really get into who runs the country, where the power is, and what it would take to change anything. They're, in that sense, they're kind of wings, two wings of the same party.
Yeah, well, isn't there like I forget what they're called, but the Republican Democratic Commission or something like that like organize these debates. So it's like you have both major parties organizing the debates anyways. And the other thing is, like, even though, like, you're right, like there are differences with, obviously Democrats are more liberal in views, and growing up, I kind of drifted towards liberal views a little bit, because more of the social issues, I kind of related with that, and I kind of agreed with their social, the way they handled social issues. But neither party are consistent with their own views anyways. One, conservatives, for example, they want, less government, small government, don't take away our guns, this and that. Unless we're talking about marijuana, then let's get the government involved and make it illegal. Or unless we're talking about gays or abortion, then let's get the government, and then liberals are the same thing. They're about people's rights and this and that, but then you get like the New York governor who, I forget what his name was, the one who was just in office, who wanted to make big sodas illegal, and because it's like that stuff is silly. So you're taking rights away. It's like one of those things where we only don't want government involved in the things that affect our lives. But then it's like if you're taking somebody else's freedoms, then it's okay to get involved. And so I just think like neither one of them are consistent with their views, and it just, again, they get us debating these silly debates about abortion or gay marriage and stuff like that. Not silly, because they are important debates, but I think that it is a great way of deflecting conversation about foreign policy and really any change that that's gonna anything that would affect change in this country, which we need. And I think that when you get like a Ron Paul or a Dennis Kucinich who really have views very different than the more mainstream candidates, I think that the first thing people do is say, well, his views are too extreme, but I think that it's a great way of getting more of the same, is like convincing everybody that anything that isn't similar to what we have had, we only need a little bit different than what we have. It's like, no, we need extreme change, because if not, then we'll just keep getting somebody who seems a little different, then they get in office and they become exactly the same. So that's kind of, I guess, my issue with voting and both political parties.
Well, I hear you. It's a big problem, and there doesn't seem to be any easy way to create viable third parties in this country because there are structural impediments. But it's certainly a goal well worth seeking.
Yeah, and even the debates, the commission, they decide beforehand the questions that are asked, the things they can and cannot talk to, right? I mean, that's all pretty well organized.
Yeah. And you notice that in every presidential election, the more independent-minded candidates are marginalized. So a Kucinich or something, they're put out literally on the far left of the camera. I don't know if, I guess maybe there are exceptions to that, but it seems to me in most cases they are marginalized and not really treated that seriously, because and then the media is all talking, the people covering it are all talking about how did Hillary do, how did Romney do, because they've already determined these are the serious candidates and the ones with a chance.
Yeah, they did the same thing with Ron Paul. I remember The Daily Show, Jon Stewart talking about it, how they would have like Ron Paul was like third in votes, and they would talk about first, second, and then hop to the fourth and fifth.
Get over it.
Yeah, and it was just, and he was, even him being more liberal, focusing on this, it was just so obvious that they were just avoiding talking about him, acting like he was a silly option and he wasn't doing well and he wasn't in the conversation when he really was. And even his foreign policy, people say, oh, well, his foreign policy was insane. I think that his foreign policy is exactly what we need. We have to stop getting involved in other countries for like you said, most of the time it's just to help corporations. And you look at like that book, War is a Racket by Wesley Butler, written in I don't know if it was the 20s or 30s, and this guy was, had all types of medals and a high-ranked military, and he wrote this book talking about how he basically thought that he was fighting for freedoms and this and that, and it really seemed like he was just fighting for big corporations. Are you familiar with this that book?
General Smedley Butler, the World War I hero, yes, indeed.
Yep.
Yes, and in fact, he was recruited, as you probably know, in the 30s for an attempted coup against Franklin Delano Roosevelt. And that was called the Bankers' Coup, and that was a bunch of Wall Street people who thought that FDR was a danger, and he was planning to crack down on Wall Street abuses, and they wanted him out. Same circles again around Prescott Bush or what have you. So again, those people who say that it couldn't happen here obviously don't know their history very well.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and that's scary. That's the thing. It's like, the way I look at it is that if they could kill the president, and when I say they, I guess it's a very vague they. I think it's a mixture of mob, CIA, like all these things. Obviously, somebody overthrew the government, and to think that these other interests could kill our democratically elected president, then what couldn't they do? It's like that should be the one untouchable person, and if they can, kill him, assassinate him, then that's kind of like my theory on it. It's like, then, kind of the way you look at things, that anything's possible. Then it's every theory is worth looking into, because because I know you say that quite a bit, that it's like you will kind of you'll look into every theory, no matter how insane or maybe outrageous it might seem, right?
I mean, I think you have to look into things. I mean, you obviously have to make a judgment because you can't cover everything. You have to make a judgment of whether it seems rational. If the either the official explanation or the counter explanation. And we have a problem in this country because our population is increasingly fragmented into these camps of people who believe anything that they're told, and those who don't believe anything they're told, who think that everything is some heinous cover up and so forth, and that's not healthy either. You have to be able to look at things with some kind of practicality. And so at whowhatwhy.com, we're very careful about that. I know there are people out there who are not happy with us because they want us to look into their pet issue, and they think that this thing was fabricated, that thing was fabricated. But, I do little soil samples here and there, and I can tell you that very often these people have very, very poor work, very poor research, what they call research standards. They're just as bad as the people on the other side. They so badly want these things to be true that they are willing to entertain the most far-fetched and illogical scenarios. And when I confront them about that, they get mad, and then they say that I'm part of the establishment. So, there's a saying: if everybody's mad at you, you must be doing something right.
Yeah, and that's true, and I'll tell you, that's why I have so much respect for people like you and Abby Martin and Jesse Ventura and all and all these people who really will say things that and people who have been in the mainstream like yourself. You've written for many mainstream magazines and stuff like that, and to hit on these topics that seem to be taboo and do it and knowing that there might be some backlash. I mean, that's I'm sure all you guys have gotten, tons of hate mail, people, fans and people who dislike maybe you hitting, talking about one topic or looking into one thing and stuff like that. So, I mean, it's when we put our work and our opinions online for the world to see, I mean, that is something that I have a lot of respect for people to do that, because, you have to be pretty confident in what you're doing and pretty comfortable with who you are and stuff like that. And I remember even when I started this show, like there was times where I would hesitate to bring something up or whatever. And I'm like, what am I doing? I'm like, just say it. I mean, be comfortable with who you are and don't be and again, it was some of that you're afraid or I was afraid a little bit of, like, well, this topic was a taboo. I don't want people to think this of me, or I don't want people, and then you just have to say, hey, you know what? If there's facts and this makes sense, why should I not talk about it? If this makes sense and there's dots that I'm connecting that seem to make sense, then absolutely talk about it and don't be afraid to. And have you ever had that where at least obviously you don't now, but at one time were you ever afraid of like dipping into some of these rabbit holes because of maybe how people might view you, or they might put you under a category that a conspiracy theorist or whatnot?
Yeah, sure. I mean, I think we all worry about those kinds of things, and then there's just the issue of quicksand. That even if these things are true, some of them are so distasteful, and they're so the consequences are so great, and they're going to require so much work to get to the bottom of the things that people say, "Oh, I'm not going to handle that one." I think everybody makes choices of what's manageable and what isn't.
Yeah, definitely. Now let's get back to the Kennedy assassination, because you talk a lot about it in your book, and I think it's just such an intriguing thing. I mean, you want to talk about some conspiracy theories that I heard at one time and I thought were bullshit, and then end up being true. Are you familiar with what was his name? Mary Mayers, who was the mistress of Kennedy, and are you familiar with her story?
Are you talking about Mary Meyer? Yeah.
Myers, yes. Yeah, that was another thing that, like, I remember somebody, or I'm reading it or hearing it somewhere, and I'm like, that sounds insane. I'm like, oh, just one of these conspiracy theories again. And then to find out that she was actually, it was pretty well known that she was a mistress of Kennedy, that obviously her husband was a CIA agent. She ends up dying, getting shot, and then they end up trying to pin it on some random, I think, African American who wouldn't let anybody in the courtroom talk about her link to the CIA and Kennedy and all this stuff, and that judge was appointed.
Yeah, listen, there are endless stories like this. I mean, I would love to stay on and keep talking with you. I'm going to have to get moving, but the Kennedy thing, we could do a whole other show on that. Yeah. And there are a zillion angles. It is a fascinating thing. Once you get in there, you get hooked, because every one of these things, I mean, Mary Meyer, there are 2, maybe even 3 books out on that subject. There are so many sub-stories, allegations that Lee Harvey Oswald, when he lived in New Orleans, was involved in, sounds crazy, but lab research relating to cancer. I mean, they're just endless avenues that one can pursue. And that is also, by the way, why it makes it very difficult to get to the bottom of the Kennedy thing and to resolve it in a way that will persuade, I think, the vast majority of the public that this is what happened, and here is who, if other people were involved, who they were.
Yeah.
But I'm committed to that type of thing. Working on a new book, and at whowhatwhy.com, we're committed both to doing a better job about current affairs, also doing stories about things that happened long ago that are still influencing our world today.
Yeah, and you're right. We probably could do a full 2 hours just on the Kennedy assassination, because there's just, like you said, it's so intriguing and there's so many layers to it. And then one story leads to another rabbit hole and another rabbit hole. And but before I let you go, looking at it, what do you think is what do you think is the best piece of evidence for people who, I almost had, I was going to get Brad Metzler, I can't say his name right, but he's from the Decoded show and the History show and stuff like that, but his schedule's a little crazy. And I remember looking into, I wanted to talk about the JFK thing, because he's one of those guys, like I've heard many people say, oh, it's just hard for people to believe that one guy could do it. And that's the thing that why people look for all these conspiracy theories. But I think there's a lot of really strong pieces of evidence that are obvious. And what would you say, so if somebody said, hey, obviously Oswald did it, what was the one piece of evidence that really convinced you that there's more to this story?
Well, there's so many of them, but for example, the original gun found by a couple of sheriff's deputies on the 6th floor of the book depository, they identified as a Mauser, and they were later told to change that to a Mannlicher Carcano rifle, because that's what was stashed by somebody in the garage where Oswald's wife was living. So that obviously is a big one. The fact that it seems impossible for 2 bullets to have done all of that damage. The fact that there's forensic evidence that another bullet hit a curb, that another bullet hit the windshield, that some of the bullets came from the front. John Connolly, who was injured, he and his wife both said that he was hit by a separate bullet. He may have been hit by 2 bullets himself. If you look at all of this stuff, if you read the evidence, it's pretty clear there must have been at least 5 shots and maybe even more. And that means it's impossible that one person did it. Right there, you have a conspiracy. The fact that the doctors at Parkland Hospital initially all said that Kennedy had been hit in the throat from the front, and were told by the FBI and the Secret Service to change their story, and were intimidated to do so. That's all you need. That's all you need. You already can see that there was a conspiracy. Now, of course, there actually are hundreds, if not thousands, of pieces of this thing like that. The fact that Lee Harvey Oswald very clearly was not a loner, that all the indications are that he had a relationship with the United States government, that the reason he went to the Soviet Union in the first place was not to defect, but to pretend to defect, that all the evidence points at that. The way that the United States helped him get there, and then they helped him come back. Now, why would you help a defector come back? I mean, they gave him money so he could come back. They expedited it. All of this is signs that he was their guy. We can go on and on and on with this stuff. That and much of this, by the way, is in my book, Family of Secrets. I get into a lot of this. That Lee Harvey Oswald had a man who was like his manager in the year prior to the assassination, and that this man had extensive connections to oil companies, to the military-industrial complex, to the intelligence agencies, and then to sort of wrap this up and come full circle, that man who managed Lee Harvey Oswald was a close and longtime friend of George H.W. Bush, Bush 41, who can't remember where he was on November 22, 1963. So I think that's a nice circular way to wrap this thing up.
Yeah, it's amazing how you remember all these names and facts and stuff like that. I definitely could not put it in as beautiful as a sentence like you just did, just to be able to put that stuff out. But yeah, it's amazing with all the research you do, the fact that you can actually remember all of it and do it. To me, because I do such a, as you can tell from your experience on the show, I go on my rants and then get off track. It's always awesome when I get to meet somebody like yourself who is very good at putting out this information. So, but thanks again, Russ Baker. I truly appreciate your time. Thanks for being with me on Halloween. And I was a little worried about hearing like the doorbell with kids at my door, like trying to get candy while we're doing this interview. But thanks again. I truly appreciate your time. I appreciate your work. I think it's like I said, I think it's really important that you're really going into these topics and these subjects with no fear and really just look at, hey, look at the facts, and these are important things to question and ask more questions and try to figure out for yourself if there's anything to it, and obviously don't just take in the official story. And so you said you're working on another book. Is that something you want to plug right now, or is it too early?
I think we'll do that later. Yeah, do that later.
Okay, well, check out his website. In our video episodes on YouTube, I always put links to our guests' their Twitter and their websites and stuff like that. And your website's full of information, like you mentioned, I believe, on the show. You can go to the search and just put in almost any topic, and you can find information on it. So if there's any of the topics we hit that you want to learn a little more about and you want to get further into, go to the website, type in the topic, and you'll find more stuff on it, because chances are Russ at one time or another has written something about it or talked about it or whatnot. So thanks again, Russ. I really appreciate your time, and keep in touch. Keep up the good work.
All right. Thank you very much.
See you, Russ.
The very word secrecy is repugnant in a free and open society, and we are, as a people, inherently and historically opposed to secret societies, to secret oaths, and to secret proceedings, and ruthless conspiracy, descent to the news, stifle dissent, cover up our mistakes.
We must guard against the acquisition of unwarranted influence, whether sought or unsought, by the military industrial complex. By the military industrial complex.
My line of work, you gotta keep repeating things over and over and over again for the truth to sink in. You gotta catapult the propaganda. You gotta catapult the propaganda. Propaganda, 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 propaganda.
There is no America. There is no democracy. There are no peace. There's no peace. There are no Russians. There are no Arabs. There are no third worlds. There is no West. There is only IBM and ITT and AT&T and DuPont, Dow and Exxon. Those are the nations. The world is a college of corporations. The world is a business.
truth. The truth.